Hello, my darling. Silvadorkable here. You are watching the third installment of putting together my 3D printed May gun from Overwatch, the video game. So as you can see, I actually have two different kinds of glue that I'm using here. I am using a liquid, very thin super glue, as well as a very well-known E3000 craft glue. Honestly, I would very much suggest the E3000 over everything. It's a bit more tacky and it's not as liquidy. It also doesn't dry quite as fast, which makes it a lot easier to work with. It also happens to be clear and dries clear, which helps kind of hide any flaws that you end up having along the way, and you can easily cut it off with a pair of scissors or a file or any small blade. So right now I'm actually just touching up the various parts, such as the pivot point that holds the canister in place, which is underneath the trigger. You will notice there are a lot of moving parts on this, which are important to glue down, or else they'll end up falling apart while you're moving it around. I noticed that acrylic paint actually works best for brushing on, whereas there is a solvent and chemicals inside of spray paint cans which cause it to strip up any kind of finish that you end up trying to paint on. So for touch-ups, I heavily suggest using acrylic paint. I actually used it as well for the accent pieces that happen to be on the sides of the gun, as well as you will see I do it for a couple other very important points. And this happens to be a metallic paint, which gives it a nice sheen and kind of just brings a little light into it. So for this, I actually used normal Scotch tape. I covered the inside of that hole with it, and once I knew that it was secure enough, I just very lightly dabbed in the acrylic paint into that layer of Scotch tape. Once it is dry, you'll actually notice that it is relatively hardened and does stick to the area, so as long as you don't put pressure on it, it's not going to budge. Now, mind you, I did do a pretty thick layer of acrylic paint on this just to make sure that it did stay. I have seen some people choose to use resin and tinting that and casting that into the inside of it. Personally, I don't have any of the equipment for resin yet, so I decided to forego that. However, if I did, I probably would have decided to use resin for the bubble that you can actually see. It is blue coming out of the top of that gun right there. Traditionally, in the actual Canon gun, that is supposed to be transparent and you're supposed to be able to see inside of it. So we're just going to use another part to prop this up so that it can dry evenly. Because of the fact that it is so thick, if you put it on its end, all of that will run out. Next, I just used a basic black and white to touch up any parts that ended up getting messed up either by my hand painting or maybe perhaps when I was gluing them they might have gotten messed up or some of the glue ended up getting onto the piece, as well as anything that ended up running or wasn't quite dry when I put it together. Using just a normal black and white acrylic paint and a brush to very carefully touch up anything works perfectly fine. You will notice that I didn't actually show painting any of the parts when it came to the spray paints. That's because I was afraid of getting the spray paint runoff or fallout onto the lens, which could end up damaging the lens. So instead, I pretty much did just a quick cut swipe, but spray painting is very simple. You can look up multiple tutorials on it, and essentially you just do a very smooth, fast, sweeping motion across the object. I have a turntable that I use in order to rotate it so that I can get an even coat, and then usually you want to let it rest for a couple hours without moving it because it will take your fingerprints and dent into it. Now this is 3D printed, each and every piece is separately 3D printed, and they have what is called infill. And an infill percentage, more or less, says how much of the inside is hollow and how much of it is not hollow. And it's usually painted in like a waffle, or not painted, printed in a waffle pattern to kind of give it some structural stability. Now, although most of these were only about 20% infill, so they do have very large holes inside of them that are covered by the outer layer, they are actually rather hefty when it comes down to it, so this item does have some weight to it. It's not going to be a very light item, but I feel that that actually does help with the fact that it is supposed to be a gun. Now, ultimately, I found that I wasn't entirely happy with the finish of the blue orb in the back of the gun. So I decided to take some of the metallic blue paint and use a cloth, which is just a normal terry cloth, to dab on and give it some texture. Ultimately, I would prefer this to be transparent so that I'm able to give it some actual depth, and maybe if I was a bit more involved in it, I could have put some LED lights into it to make it more accurate. However, considering that I had already superglued and jabbed the entire orb into there, which happened to be a huge pain for the record if you didn't see my previous video, I figured it was just easier to paint over it. So you will notice that it has kind of a frosty sort of metallic sheen to it now, which I felt looked a little bit better than the actual blue, pure, just flat color. This is one thing I really do love about acrylic paints is the fact that you can layer them over pretty much anything. Granted, mixing them can be a little bit challenging if you mix it and then later on want to get the exact same shade. Getting the same color to match is a little bit challenging. However, I do find that when it comes to layering effects, even acrylic paint can be used for adding things like dirt and dry brushing, giving it a weathered effect, which is very helpful and actually really impressive when you can do it right. I just felt that this needed a little bit more texture and a little bit more to it instead of just a flat cartoony piece of plastic there. Now, there are a lot of different texture brushes that you can get for this. Personally, I just happen to have that rag there that I was using for cleaning my hands off or cleaning brushes off, which did have a good texture to it. They also sell texturized brushes, they sell sponge brushes, you can dry brush. There are a lot of different techniques that you can find, especially when it comes to acrylic paints because they are so versatile. However, I did find that this was just the easiest thing that I had on hand and kind of winged it when it came to getting any kind of effect with it. Now, the great thing about using these kind of acrylic paints is if you end up messing up, you can always go back over it. So I ended up using white to just touch up the sides where I had kind of spilled over just a little bit with my texturing, just to clean it up a little and make it look a little bit more presentable. And in the background, you can actually see my 3D printer, which I haven't done an official review of yet. However, for those of you who are curious, it is a Creality CR-10S Pro. I highly recommend it. It is a little bit spendy. I happened to get it on sale, but even then it was still like $500. It is very useful, it's very smooth, and it's very easy to use once you know the ins and outs of the program that comes with the actual machine, which honestly, I really do like it. I would heavily suggest 3D printing for anyone who really likes making props or replicas. I know I'm going to be using this a lot when it comes to cosplay props because finding a cosplay prop is incredibly expensive, and even buying ones that are pre-printed for you can run in the hundreds of dollars. I actually have a May gun that I ended up buying at a convention for 50% off, and even then it still cost me $20. The problem is that that gun happens to be an entire solid molded piece of foam. And although from far away it does look a little bit, convincing, when you get close enough to it, it looks very sloppily painted. There's a lot of parts where the paint ends up running over lines that shouldn't be there. Pieces of it are missing because of the injection process and the fact that it was very cheaply made. You end up with a lot of areas that just don't look as they should rightfully, but from far away, you're not going to notice that. Since I actually would like to do a real May cosplay down the road and maybe take this to a convention somewhere, I figure having something that looks a little bit more convincing can just add to the costume. I'm also going to be working on her endothermic tank. However, that is not going to be 3D printed due to the fact that the endothermic tank happens to be incredibly large. I've purchased a couple pieces that I'm going to be using to kind of jimmy rig a tank together, as well as a group of styrofoam that I'm going to be using to personally sculpt it out. I will be doing a video on that as well when I do get around to it. Because of the holiday season, I haven't really touched it lately. However, I want to do a really quick reminder just for those of you who are curious about working with styrofoam. Although styrofoam and any kind of foam can be a very good cosplay medium, and it's very cheap and it's disposable, so you don't have to worry about messing it up too much because you can always go buy a new piece. Don't ever use any kind of aerosol spray or spray paint on styrofoam of any kind. It actually ends up eating away the styrofoam, and that includes things like Plastidip or any kind of varnish. Anything that's an aerosol can will essentially have the solvents inside of the can and inside of the formula that will eat away at styrofoam. So it actually can be a little bit dangerous. So please don't do that. Just avoid that altogether. When it comes to painting styrofoam, you always want to use a brush of some sort, and that includes acrylic painting specifically. So that concludes this episode. We will pick this up on the next one where we will continue putting pieces together, and I hope to see you then. Love you, darlings.